And here's Keith and Danny.
R.T., Margaret, and the Rats of NIMH by Jane Leslie Conley. Chapter 1. This might be it. Raxo, his black beret cocked at a jaunty angle on his furry head, stood staring into the contents of a clay beaker. He took a step backward, forward, to the side, then twirled it neatly around in a silent dance. I mean, Isabella, this really might be it. Isabella, a taller rat with curly whiskers, looked skeptical. This is only the 100th time you've said that this month, Raxo. Yeah, but that was before I added the honeysuckle. The honeysuckle makes all the difference. It might make all the difference, is what you mean. Isabella shook her head in disgust. I have to go. I'm in charge of dinner tonight. Raxo grinned. I was hoping you were, and I've been hoping we could have carrots baked with honey, like you made last time. Then you should have asked right from the start instead of acting like you made a great discovery. Raxo looked injured. You should give me the benefit of the doubt. Elvira thinks my potion made Brutus's shoulder heal a lot faster than usual. I saw him by the pond yesterday, and he was hardly limping at all. Brutus had been climbing the mountain trail the month before and had been attacked by a hawk. Isabella rolled her eyes. I'll put your picture up beside Louis Pasteur's. That's enough. No bickering in the laboratory. An older female rat stood in the doorway. Elvira, I thought you were down by the brook, gathering herbs. Well, I'm back, and I'd like a little peace and quiet, if you don't mind. I've mixed up something new, Raxo said quickly. I added some honeysuckle to the stuff I made last week, and I think... Out. She brushed his words aside, smiling. I need to concentrate, and that means being alone. You can help me pull up the carrots, Isabella said. You'll need at least 100. So she was going to make his favorite dish. Raxo was pleased. As they walked down the central hallway of the rat's huge nest, he couldn't help remembering his first trip down that corridor, almost 2 years before. He had been a runaway from the big city, tired and scared, and Isabella had scorned him. He'd been afraid to tell her who his father was, because he was afraid she would scorn him even more. Jenner had been one of the super-intelligent rats who'd escaped from the famous laboratories at NIMH and founded their own colony. But Jenner had argued with the other leaders and had returned to the city an exile. Later, he had died a hero, sabotaging a dam that would have flooded Thorn Valley. And Raxo and the other rats in the sabotage unit had returned as heroes too. After that, Isabella's attitude toward Raxo had changed, and for the better. Gonna meet my sweetie tonight, Raxo sang softly. They passed the school, out of session because it was summer, the meeting room, the nursery, then the many arched doorways that led into the rats' bedrooms. Raxo pointed to the door of his own room. Just that morning he'd tacked a piece of birch bark paper to the wooden door. It was decorated with flowers and hearts drawn with pokeweed ink, and in the center, in fancy lettering, was the message, Raxo loves Isabella. Raxo had practiced the special curlicues that went on the A's for 2 days before he'd made the sign. And he was happy with how they'd come out. But Isabella didn't seem as excited as he'd thought she'd be. Instead, she stood there staring at the sign and pulling on her whiskers as if something was bothering her. Don't you like it? Uh, sure, Axel. Did I spell your name wrong or something? No, you got it right. Isabella hesitated. But there is something I'd like to talk to you about. Raxo scowled. That sign was a work of art. She certainly didn't appreciate him the way she should. They entered the dining room, Isabella striding ahead. There were a few rats sharing lunch out of big wooden bowls. Raxo guessed that they'd been working somewhere far off and had gotten back late. He noticed his own bowl, with his name engraved on it, near the bottom of a stack of dishes. When he'd first come to Thorn Valley, he'd been appalled by the rats' menu. Vegetables, 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 with here and there maybe a few fruits and nuts mixed in. He'd taught them to make candy, now a favorite treat for the whole community, but for the most part he just had to get used to eating their way. Sometimes he still thought about the corner deli on the street where he'd been born. At night, he and his friends would sneak under the lunch counter, finding pieces of barbecue potato chips and crumbs from a jelly donut. Raxo! Isabella tossed him a bag woven out of vines and took another one for herself. We ought to be able to fit all the carrots in here. She took a knife from a rack on the kitchen wall. This is all we'll need. We can cook them outdoors. That'll keep the kitchen from getting too hot. A moment later, they were standing in the big back doorway, flooded with sunlight. Thorn Valley was lovely in summer. The mountainsides were covered with laurel and rhododendron, and the meadows were yellow and pink with clumps of buttercups and wild roses. Directly in front of them, a slate walkway bordered by wild geraniums led to the pine grove by the brook. Over to the right were the gardens, square plots filled with beets and turnips and lettuces and cabbages and sweet potatoes and wild asparagus and peppers. Between these were blackberry thickets. There were 3 walnut trees and a chestnut oak for acorns, sassafras saplings for sassafras tea and root beer, and 3 large beehives. To the left was the playground the young rats had built with the help of Arthur, the engineer. Raxo still loved to slide down the bamboo slide and swing back and forth on the grapevine swing. Down the hill a bit was Emerald Pond. The rats had created it by damming a stream when they moved to the valley 4 years ago. Now bamboo pipes carried water underground from the pond to the nest and gardens, and just above the pond was the guard tower. Raxo shuddered involuntarily. The guard tower was new. Over the spring, 2 rats had been killed and carried away by a hawk, and 2 more had been wounded. Now the sky above the gardens was watched continually, and an alarm sounded as soon as the hawk appeared. Everyone had to dive for cover and stay there until it was gone. Are you daydreaming? Isabella gave him a friendly poke. Is it about me? Raxo grinned. Not this time. He didn't want to admit he'd been thinking about the hawk. What was it you were going to tell me anyway? They had begun walking toward the carrot patch. Isabella looked around to make sure no one else could hear. I'm trying to change my image, she whispered. What? My image. What the other rats think of me. I'm tired of being plain old Isabella. I want to be thought of as responsible, like Nicodemus or Justin or Hermione. If someone has a problem, I want him to think, who could give me good advice? Arthur? Elvira? Beatrice? No, Isabella. Raxo stared. He could hardly believe his ears. For Isabella to think that someone would compare her to the leaders of the colony? To dream that others would think she had the wisdom of Nicodemus, who had founded Thorn Valley? The quick mind of Justin, head of the security forces, or the knowledge of the teacher Hermione. Isabella was a kid, like him. They arrived at the plot and settled into work, pulling each carrot, shaking the dirt off, flinging it into the bag. But why do you want to change your image? Raxo tried to keep his voice casual, as if the idea was entirely sensible. Isabella hesitated, as if the next admission were a bit embarrassing for her. Well, a couple of years ago, when I was really young, before I knew any better, that is, Isabella shook a carrot hard, as if it had more dirt on it than it really did. I sort of had a crush on Justin. You had just recently come here, so I don't know if you remember. Do I remember? Raxo felt like laughing out loud. How could I forget? You walked around behind Justin as if you were tied to him with a string. You sat in front of him and tried to get his attention at meetings. And if something needed to be done for him, you always tried to do it first. And you used to go around saying, Justin says, as if he were your idol. And you, all right, Raxo. Isabella threw a carrot so hard that it broke in two. You don't have to make fun of me. I'm not making fun of you. You asked if I remember. And now I know you do, Isabella snapped. Anyway, what? Isabella pursed her snout. Well, I think there are rats who might have formed the impression that I was a little... She seemed to be searching for just the right word. Raxo tried to help. A little dumb? No. Silly? I was not silly. Isabella laid her ears back against her head, a sure sign that she was angry. She worked for a while in silence. She was fast. The carrots followed one another into the bag. 1, 2, 3. I was very young back then, she said, and now and then I let my emotions get the better of me. You might say I was flighty, but I would say that I simply wasn't as mature as I am today. Raxo decided to keep quiet. I'm different now, Isabella continued. Time has mellowed me. Raxo was pretty sure they'd read that line in a novel at school, but he nodded. My judgment has grown sound, and I am ready to share my wisdom. But I fear that the image from years ago might remain in the minds of some rats. Those who don't know me well, that is. And the sign you made, though it is very beautiful, Axel, and I love the way you did my name with those curlicues, well, it might remind the others of the old Isabella, and I wouldn't want that. We could ask the others what they think about you, Raxo said practically. We could ask Christopher. I see him right over there, picking blackberries. I'd rather wait until I got the chance to improve my image. Isabella thumped another carrot into the bag. I think we've got about 100 here. She began to count. Raxo stood quietly. He still got confused when he counted in the high numbers. He waved to Christopher, a whitish rat with a long tail. Christopher waved back. He must have finished his experiment with the solar collector, Raxo thought, or else he wouldn't be working in the garden. Christopher despised most jobs. Too dull, he always said. Then Raxo noticed that for every berry his friend put in the basket, he put another into his mouth. No wonder he'd volunteered to pick blackberries. 115, Isabella finished. That should be plenty. Now we'll wash them and cut them. Raxo dragged the 2 bags over to a place where a bamboo spigot came up from an underground pipe. The shower of water felt good on their paws, and they splashed each other, laughing. They washed each carrot and set it on a pile of straw. The washing created a small river of muddy water, and 2 baby rats ran up and began to play in it. Their mother, who was working in the parsnips, called to them crossly. Seymour! Michaelina, come back here. It's dangerous to wander away. Seymour didn't run back, but Michaelina darted up to Raxo with an impish look in her eyes. She pranced back and forth. Carrots for supper, she chanted. With honey, Raxo nodded. The little rat jumped up and down. Yum! Michaelina! Bye-bye, shouted the little rat. She ran away toward her mother. Raxo and Isabella laughed. What's so funny? Christopher's berry-stained nose appeared from around the hedgerow. You two flirting again? Isabella stiffened. No. She's trying to change her image, Raxo explained. She wants to be taken seriously. Oh, Christopher looked puzzled. Why? In case I want to become president of Thorn Valley, Isabella said lightly. Christopher looked as if he'd accidentally swallowed something the wrong way. He coughed several times. Then he said, Of course. Now, we need 4 cups of honey, Isabella said in the same matter-of-fact tone. And the clay pot from the shelf over the stove. We're in luck. Here comes Beatrice. A brown rat with delicate features and sharp, sparkly eyes headed toward them. Beatrice was married to Justin and was in charge of the beehives. We were just about to come look for you, Raxo said. We need to get some honey. Beatrice smiled. And I was just looking for you. Elvira thought you'd come out here. We got a letter from the Frisbees. Nothing new, really, but I thought you'd like to read it anyway. It's on Justin's desk. I do want to. Timothy Frisbee, a field mouse who lived with his family on a farm not far from the valley, was Raxo's best friend. They'd met when Raxo was on his way to Thorn Valley to find the rats. Timothy had discovered that Raxo had run away from his home in the city because he wanted to learn to read and write. Since Timothy was traveling to the rat school, he volunteered to take Raxo with him. This year, Timothy wasn't coming to school in the valley, though. Instead, he planned to stay on the farm to do experiments with seeds and soil so that the rats could improve their gardening techniques. Raxo missed Timothy already. I'll get the honey, Beatrice said. How much do you need? 4 cups will do fine. Isabella was pleased with how efficient and grown-up her voice sounded. Her paws handled the knife skillfully as she sliced each carrot into 4 pieces. Maybe I'll go with you, Christopher said. I'm bored. So bored that you're ready to brave the beehives. Beatrice laughed. No, thanks. Bees do better when they're handled by the same keeper over and over. Too bad, Christopher. You can't even get stung when you want to, Isabella said. But you can make a fire in the outdoor oven for me and put the clay pot on it, with about 2 quarts of water inside. Oh, I forgot to tell you something, Beatrice came back. The messenger who brought the letter, a crow, saw a tent in Northwoods just on the other side of the mountain. But Justin wasn't worried about it. He says humans camp there and go fishing in the stream. They always seem to leave after a few days. Watch out! A high-pitched whistle shrieked from the guard tower. The rats dove for cover. From the thorny hedge, Raxo saw the shadow of wings fall across the garden. He gasped. The baby rat who had been scampering in the water, Michelina, was alone in the turnip plot. The hawk turned sharply, hovered. A large, bony rat dashed from nowhere, flung the baby headfirst into the blackberry bushes, and was gone. The hawk screamed. Raxo clung to the brambles with all 4 paws. Chapter 2. Crack, crack, crack. The feel of the old branch breaking against the solid tree trunk was pleasurable to the girl, and she held it tight with both hands and smacked it with all her might. The rotten branch flew in every direction. One of the pieces banged against the leg of the folding metal table with a nice ring. Another one hit Arthur right in the small of the back. He made a sound in between a moan and a growl, but he didn't look up from where he was sitting in front of the fire. He had a little metal tractor in his hands. "Margaret, you stop banging that stick. You just hit your brother with it, and it could have hurt him." Her mother's voice was sharp. "What if it had hit him in the eye?" "Sorry." Secretly, she thought, if it had hit him in the eye, maybe he would have done something. Maybe he would have stood up and yelled like any other kid. Margaret was sure that Arthur could talk if he wanted to. She knew that he understood things, even when he pretended he didn't. But he had their mother and dad so worried about him that they didn't know what to do except to yell at Margaret as if it were her fault. She hadn't wanted to come camping anyway, but they had made her, saying the idea of a 10-year-old girl staying in the house by herself while the rest of the family was on vacation was just ridiculous. But wouldn't she have had a great time? She and Leon, who lived next door, could have watched TV all day if they wanted to. They could have lived on junk food. They could have worn the same clothes every day. They could have made crazy telephone calls to the places with toll-free numbers, like the Swiss Turkey Hotline and Rubber Duck Baby Pants Company. They could have eaten pizza for breakfast, ice cream for lunch, and M&Ms for dinner. She imagined dividing the packages of M&Ms into colors, then putting all the browns in one corner of the plate. That would be the meat, and the greens in another, the beans, and then the oranges, carrots, a perfectly balanced meal. She sighed. Even before the camping trip, her mother had been bugging her. She had taken Margaret aside one day and said, "Maybe the kids won't tease you so much, honey, if you lose a little weight." Margaret had been furious. "I don't want to look like a stupid Barbie doll," she said. "Maybe they'll stop calling you names like piano legs and cream puff," her mom insisted. And for dessert, she had cut Margaret a piece of cake so thin that it could hardly stand up by itself. Margaret kicked her sneaker into a pile of moldy leaves. Camping. She had finished all her comic books, and there wasn't anything left to do. The whole thing was just unfair. "Margaret!" Her dad's voice drifted down from where he was chopping wood. She began to wander in his direction, winding around trees and thickets as if she were lost inside a maze. Her short brown curls bounced as she walked. She was wearing jeans and a green sweatshirt with a picture of a unicorn on it. She'd picked the sweatshirt out at Kmart last year, just before school started. "I want you to help me carry this wood down so we can make a big fire." Her father looked a lot like Margaret. His face was more round than square, and he also had curly hair. "How about letting me chop some wood?" Margaret had asked this once before, and her dad had let her try, but he had been nervous. She guessed he thought she'd accidentally cut her leg off. Then he'd have one kid who couldn't talk and one who couldn't walk. The thought of herself hobbling along on one leg gave Margaret pleasure. She imagined what the other kids in her class would say. Some would be sorry for her, she supposed. Others, like Roy Warnell and Eleanor Huber, would probably say she had done it just for attention. To her surprise, her dad handed her a hatchet, keeping hold of the handle with one hand. He again showed her how to raise it above her shoulders and bring it down at an angle to cut a wedge into the yellow pulp of the wood. The wood gave off a pungent smell that tickled her nose. She lifted the hatchet again and again, until at last there was only a thin strip holding the log to the trunk. Then he showed her how to push that with her foot until it snapped and the log fell.
Good job, Margaret. This locust is hard to cut, but it'll burn a long time.
Did you learn that when you were in Scouts? He nodded.
Sure did, and a lot more, too.
Her father had been a Boy Scout when he was a kid, and he'd loved it. That was when he'd learned to hike and fish and camp. That was one reason he thought the camping trip was such a good idea. She tried to tell him that kids were into other things these days. Things like hard rock and skateboards and garbage pail kids. But he hadn't really listened.
You don't know what it's like to sleep out under the stars, Margaret,
He'd said.
Once you get a taste of the great outdoors, you'll never get it out of your system.
But what about Artie? Margaret's mother had sounded worried. Arthur was pale and thin with fine orangey hair. He had asthma. He had to be taken to the hospital every week for shots. Some of the other kids said Arthur was retarded, but the doctors said they couldn't tell for sure.
It might be the best thing for Artie. I think it'd help him get out of the house for a while, to see something besides his room and that junk he watches on TV.
And so they traded the Buick for Uncle Chris's truck for a week, and Uncle Chris had shown them a map with an old logging road leading into the state forest, and here they were. Margaret, would you mind watching Artie for a little while? I have a headache, and I thought if I could just lie down for a few minutes, I might be able to get rid of it. Her mom's voice trailed off from inside the tent. Her father had spent the morning fishing and had come back to clean the fish and cook them over the fire for lunch. Margaret didn't think she'd like fish, and she'd been certain Arthur wouldn't eat his. Sure enough, he'd sat staring straight ahead until their mom brought him a peanut butter sandwich, the same thing he always had. After lunch, their dad had taken the truck into town to get more groceries and some extra fish hooks, and she and Arthur and Mom had stayed at the campsite. Margaret, would you mind? Her mother repeated. Her voice sounded tired. All right. Margaret really felt like saying, Quit bugging me. But she felt a little sorry for her mom because she hadn't wanted to go camping either. She was a city person who never put on a pair of blue jeans. She took Margaret to museums and concerts and tried to make her happy. But she worried a lot, especially about Arthur, and she got headaches from worrying. Margaret knew that she herself would never have any children. When she grew up, she planned to have fun all the time and to do whatever she wanted to without worrying about anyone else. She planned to make a lot of money on the stock market right away, so she wouldn't have to have a job. She wouldn't be like any of the grown-ups she knew. She was going to be just like she was now, except without anyone to boss her around, and without Arthur. Arthur was sitting near the ashes of the fire, playing with a toy car. He made it go around and around in a circle, and he would flip it into the air and let it fall. Weird kid. She lifted the lid off the cooler and found a package of raisin cookies. She took 3 for herself and gave 1 to Arthur, who dropped the car and clutched the cookie with both hands. Margaret, don't eat sweets now. There's fruit if you want it, or a diet soda. Her mother must have heard the rustle of cellophane. Margaret made a face at the tent, took 1 more cookie, and put the rest back. Come on, we'll go for a little walk, she said to Arthur in a loud voice. Don't go too far, honey, her mother called from inside the tent. This time, Margaret didn't even bother to answer. She grabbed Arthur by the arm and pulled him upright. She put his hand in hers and started off. He trotted obediently beside her. Now, Artie, where would you like to go? To her surprise, Arthur didn't ignore the question. Instead, he looked around him, up and down the wooded valley, and inclined his head forward as if pointing in that direction. That way? She watched. Arthur didn't nod, but he started walking in the direction he had indicated. so Margaret walked along beside him. She had always thought that Arthur understood more than he let on, and she often tried to test him, to see exactly what he did understand. Sometimes she stood and listened outside the door of his bedroom to see if she could hear him talking to himself. He had talked some when he was very small. She remembered he'd said things like mama and dada and ball, and had even spoken short sentences like go out. That was before he got sick. Later, he got more and more quiet until suddenly she noticed that he never talked anymore. And when she mentioned it to her mother, it turned out that she had noticed it a long time ago and had taken Arthur to a doctor for that, too. But the doctor couldn't do anything about it. Her mother had cried when she told Margaret this, and Margaret had felt mad at Arthur for causing so much trouble. It wasn't easy having a brother like Arthur. She eyed him appraisingly. He was funny looking. His wispy hair reminded her of the fluff on a dandelion, and he kept his face fixed in a sort of blank expression, without looking around to see what was going on. Occasionally, something seemed to interest him. He loved animals, and he had toys that he played with on his own, scooting them around on the floor in circles. All the kids said Arthur was weird. She sometimes complained to her dad about Arthur. The kids tease me just because of him, once she said. He's doing it just to make me unpopular. But her dad shook his head.
Artie is Artie, he had said. We just have to accept him. If he wants to, one day he'll talk to us. But then again, maybe he won't.
You don't accept me for what I am, Margaret had argued. You're always trying to change me.
You and Arthur are different, her dad said quietly.
She looked around. They were at the crest of a hill. Just below them was the old logging road they had followed to get to the campsite. Margaret saw the ruts their truck had made when her dad had turned it around to drive into town. She looked back over her shoulder. Far away through the trees, she could make out a blotch of orange, the tent. Arthur pulled her hand in the opposite direction toward the logging trail. Margaret hesitated. I guess we can turn around and fall it back when we need to, she said. We'll know to go up the hill when we get to the ruts. They walked a short distance with Arthur leading the way. The road twisted this way, that way. Sometimes it seemed to disappear, but then Margaret would see an opening. They would go through, and the track would be there. They saw a blue jay fly in front of them, scolding angrily. He must have a nest nearby, Margaret explained. She felt proud of how nice she was being to Arthur, but then she added, I think we should turn back now. We've been gone quite a while. Arthur looked disappointed, but they turned around anyway and went back along the track, through an opening to a place where the path curved around a big thicket. And there, in the middle of the road, was a bear. Chapter 3. There aren't any bears around here, Margaret thought. Arthur gave her hand a fast, hard jerk. The bear was standing on its hind legs with its mouth open. Margaret was afraid to move, afraid to stand still. In her horror, she noticed the quiet shifting of the leaves on the trees, the jay's voice still scolding in the background. She turned and ran, dragging Arthur behind her. She did not look back. The air was filled with the wild crashing of their flight through the brambles. Or was it the bear behind them? Once Arthur tripped and fell, and she pulled him along the ground like a burlap bag filled with stones until he managed to get his feet back under him again. His weight was like a cement block, pulling her back. She wondered if they would both die. She kept going, running through whatever was in front of her, even when the brush looked like a thick wall. She felt as if she were a part of a 3D movie, and she wanted to say, "This cannot be real." She didn't know how long she had been running when she finally looked back and saw nothing but woods and brush and leaves. She dropped to the ground and pulled Arthur down with her. She closed her eyes and listened. The crashing was gone. The only sound was her own panting, a terrible, gasping sound, and Arthur's sobbing. She looked at Arthur. His face was streaked with tears and his eyes were wide with terror. "It's all right, Artie," she said. "It's gone now." He glanced at her quickly. She wondered if he knew that she was lying, that she had no idea where the bear was or whether it would come back. She wasn't sure how long they lay silently on the ground, holding on to each other until Arthur stopped crying. There was no sound now except for the chirping of birds and the wind rustling the leafy canopy of the trees. "Maybe we should stand up," Margaret said finally. She got up on her hands and knees, then all the way. Her legs trembled, and she had to make a conscious effort to steady them by putting her weight first on one, then the other. She grasped Arthur by the arm and pulled him up too. He let his legs collapse so that she was holding his full weight. She tried it again, and he did the same thing. "All right," she said. "I'll leave you here by yourself." For a moment, she thought that Arthur was actually going to speak. He opened his mouth in the shape of the word "no," and his blue eyes overflowed with tears. Slowly, he got up on all fours, then grabbed the pocket of Margaret's jeans and pulled himself to his feet. He stood there stiffly, as if he were made of wood. "We'll go this way," Margaret said. "This is the way we came." They walked back through the woods, skirting the heavy underbrush. There were places where the leaves seemed to be pushed around, as if someone had come running through. At first, Margaret thought they formed a sort of trail, but later there seemed to be so many paths that she decided they must have been made by the wind. She transferred Arthur's hand from her pocket to her hand and held it tight. Although she couldn't be sure, she was pretty certain she was heading in the right direction, and she thought the logging road should appear at any moment. They walked and walked. Margaret remembered from school that there was a way to tell direction by the location of the sun. She stopped and checked. It was over her left shoulder, dropping almost even with the treetops. Did that mean the west was to her left? Where had the sun been this morning? It had been shining through the window of the tent onto her face. She had come out, and it had been behind the tent as she faced it. East. But what direction had they taken on the walk? West, of course, and when they had turned right on the logging road, that would have been north, meaning that they should head southeast to get back to the campsite. That would be away from the sun, which was the direction they were walking, and perhaps a little more to the right. But to the right there were pine trees, and Margaret was sure she hadn't seen those before. The ground began to slope upward. They had come over a hill when they first started walking, so for a moment Margaret thought they must be very close to the tent. She had the idea that if she could reach the top of the hill, she would be so high up that she could look down and see the campfire and the tent. And so she hurried, pulling Arthur along by the hand. The ground remained steep, but there did seem to be a small path up the hillside. By now, the sun had slipped below the tree line, so that the light was filtered and the air was cooler. Margaret was confused. She kept going over the directions in her mind. They had come west, then north, then they had seen the bear and run off. Which way? They were heading east, which must be right, yet everything looked unfamiliar, and she was sure the hill they'd crossed on the way hadn't been nearly this steep. Arthur moaned. Margaret looked down at him. She'd been concentrating so hard she'd almost forgotten about him. Probably it had been hard for him to keep up. Soon it would be twilight. The chances of finding the tent at dusk didn't seem good. She decided to let Arthur rest for a minute, and sat down with him on a mossy stone. He still looked scared. "We're on our way back to the tent, Artie, and when we get there, we'll have supper. Maybe hot dogs and beans or hamburgers? She tried to reassure him, but Arthur didn't seem to be listening. And hearing herself, Margaret felt frightened and alone. She felt like shouting, "I'm lost!" But she couldn't because of Arthur. She wondered if her parents were looking for them. Her mom had been almost asleep when they left, and she had no idea how much time had gone by since then. Several hours at least, and her dad had been in town. The shopping might take him a long time. "Are you feeling better, Artie? Ready to go on?" She kept her voice cheerful, as if they were doing something fun. She thought briefly of Leon. Wait until he heard about this. He'd probably say she'd made the whole thing up, especially the part about the bear. The bear. With a shiver, Margaret looked around, but the woods were quiet. She pulled Arthur to his feet. His hand felt as limp as a rag. They began walking up the hill. Sometimes it was so steep that Margaret had to stand behind Arthur and boost him over rocks. She no longer told herself that they would find the campsite any time now. Instead, she held on to the idea that when she got to the top of the hill, she would be able to see smoke from the fire. They came to a patch that was all rock. They had to climb over it on their hands and knees. When they'd reached the end, Margaret turned and looked back. She gasped. Spread out to her right were thousands of tiny trees, and behind them the orange ball of the setting sun. The view to her left was obscured by a rock shelf that jutted into the air at an odd angle. She searched the forest for a trail of smoke, but there was nothing. She sat down on the nearest rock. They were lost, and it was getting dark. She imagined Leon saying, "And of all the people to be stuck with, your little brother." But there was nothing funny about it. She bit her lip to keep from crying. Arthur looked up at her, his eyes round. She felt as if they were the only two people left in the world. What would become of them? And it was all her fault. She should never have gone so far from the tent. She imagined her mother's face, her mouth open, calling their names. If only she could hear her voice or feel her mother's arms around her. But instead, the silence seemed to form a circle around them, as if nothing, no person, no sound could get in. "We'll have to go on," she said out loud. "There's nothing else to do. We'll have to try and find somebody." She remembered her dad saying that the state forest included thousands of acres of wilderness. "We're lost, Artie," she said in a weak voice. Arthur began to cry again. "Don't do that," Margaret said. "It won't help." To her surprise, Arthur stopped. He rubbed his sleeve against his face, then stood up stiffly and held out one hand. They began walking up the hill. They walked until it was dark. They reached a part of the hill where there were no more trees, only stone. Then suddenly Arthur stumbled. Margaret saw that he was walking with his eyes almost closed. She picked him up under the arms. He wasn't heavy, and the stone under her feet was smooth and flat. She carried him that way for 50 yards, then laid him down and rested herself. She felt numb. She picked Arthur up and carried him a bit further, then rested again. It was funny. She didn't feel tired. She was scared, more scared than she'd ever been. But at the same time, she felt clear-headed and steady. She thought about the day, how it had started out, with all them waking up in the tent, eating cereal, the fishing trip, the walk, the bear, and now this. It had been the longest day of her whole life, and she might die, and Arthur might die. She glanced at him, lying curled on his side, fast asleep. She had never liked him much, had simply thought of him as someone to be put up with. But now they were stuck with each other. She decided she would save him if she could. After that, she felt a little better. It was as if there were a reason for things to turn out okay. She picked him up, carrying him draped over her two arms the way someone carries a baby. Her stocky legs pumped steadily up the hillside. Now and then she stopped, laid him down, and rested. He slept heavily, without stirring. Sometime later, how much later she wasn't sure, she reached the crest of the hill. She put Arthur down and looked back the way she had come. In the moonlight, she saw the shape of trees spreading as far as she could see. It was too dark to see anything else. The night had grown cool, and the air became a fine, thin mist. She had to find a place for them to sleep. She searched among the rocks, crossing a sort of natural walkway and then descending. She found a dark opening between stones, a cave. Inside it was dry. From the side of the rock by the entrance grew a small pine tree. She put Arthur down, crawled inside, and pulled him in after her. The ground smelled musty, like old pine needles. She curled up to sleep. It was only then, just as she was about to close her eyes, that she remembered Arthur's medicine.
No.